one thing we implemented early on post quarantine was geared breathing, and so we use we use different nasal breathing patterns and mouth breathing patterns to dictate intensity. One thing that we don't do a lot in CrossFit and we don't do at Kaw Valley is heart rate monitoring, where you can, if your heart rate goes up, your intensity has now gone up. And so if we don't have our heart rate monitors, how do we manage intensity? So we use different patterns. The gears are as follows. Starting with gear 1, that's an equal nasal inhale with a nasal exhale. Okay, and it's pretty slow. That's the guy. Yeah. I've got it pulled up. That's the one I got pulled up. That's it.
Put it on the screen.
Excellent. So gear 1 is about 12 breaths a minute if we're getting really specific, which is pretty slow. On average, you're probably going to breathe about 16 times to 18 times a minute. But ideally we want to be about 12 or maybe even lower to like 10. Anyhow, so gear 1 is what you would do for if you're hanging out, you're chilling, you're going for a really like easy walk. That's gear 1. It's your low aerobic state. Moving up from there.
I'm not sure this will be visible, but let's try.
We'll try. Gear 2 is essentially kind of your warm-up weight or your warm-up gear. You're still all nasal, but you're breathing in a little bit more intensely than you were in gear 1. Not a big difference, but it's still calm. It's still very, very efficient. And that's your high aerobic state. So think warm up, you're going for an easy jog. Things are still relatively calm. You're not trying that hard.
I have found this to be fantastic for all the zone 2 heart rate biking and running that I do.
Huge correlation with zone 2 for sure.
It's awesome. I mean, I know gear 2 and zone 2, all the things don't necessarily correlate directly to a zone per se, but it's awesome.
Yep. Gear 3 is where we get into some fun stuff. So gear 3 is essentially you're still all through the nose, but you can kind of go as hard as you want as long as you can keep your mouth shut. So this is where we start to get into a big shift towards more intensity. Here it's listed as a working bellows breath, and so it sounds like this. Super loud, kind of obnoxious. Snot goes places.
I'm sorry, I have no idea how that's going to sound.
I don't know either. I just wanted to see. But this is our anaerobic threshold. So we're looking at moving towards an unsustainable pace. Gear 3 should still be sustainable, I think. And this is also something I've realized by training these things is you can be in gear 4 and be forcing yourself into gear 3. So if you're in gear 3 and you're just miserable, you're probably in gear 4, or you probably should be in gear 4. You just are being stubborn. So gear 3 again is still nasal, but it's as hard as you can go, keeping your mouth shut. So then we get into some higher intensity things where gear 3 should be sustainable for a long time. That's where we can learn new movement patterns. We can kind of test out movement patterns. Gear 4, gear 5 is where we let the wheels come off a little bit. So gear 4 is very interesting. You probably don't do it ever unless you're trying, but it's in through the nose, out through the mouth. Right? And so we're in this anaerobic state. Our power output has gotten so far that we need to get that CO2 out of our system before it makes everything super acidic. But we're still controlling the breath. We're still driving that nasal inhale. And that's big as far as being in control of what your body is doing, right? So things can get really intense for gear 4. I think it's one of the nastier gears because you have to keep that control. And if you drive it up, again, just like you could do gear 4 within the constraints of gear 3, you can be in gear 4 and probably need to be in gear 5. And I've done ones where it feels like my nose is going to pinch itself off because I was inhaling so hard. But so that's gear 4. And that's where honestly most of CrossFit should be as far as training, should be somewhere in between gear 3 and gear 4. You gonna say something?
No.
Okay. Then moving up, gear 5, mouth breathing. Mouth in, mouth out. This is high anaerobic. It's not sustainable. We're going for it. And so one thing you'll learn as you dive into these gears is you really can judge. Like if you're forcing yourself to work your way up in gear, like let's say you're doing 50 calories for time on the bike and you start out in gear 3, you'll notice eventually you're at a pace that's not sustainable and you have to go to gear 4, and then you get to gear 5 and you're just working. Eventually it's going to run out. Like you're going to run out of steam. And so that's where those lower gears become important. We kind of see, are we going too fast? Are we going too slow? And so we can learn a lot about what's going on under the hood, if you will, with these gears. So gear 5 is something that you should probably only do once a week, if not every other week or so, or at least controlling it. So one of the workouts we're going to do Tuesday on the calories, we're going to keep it with gear 4. But when we go to the barbell movement, we can go to gear 5. And so the interesting thing with these gears is when you add a barbell into things or a high skill movement that involves a lot of respiratory mechanics, like toes to bar, for example, you're in this extreme spinal extension and then you got to close it into spinal flexion. That's a lot of stress on the diaphragm and the abs. And so it's really hard to do that nasal breathing for sure. So if we can do barbell movements in gear 3, we're going to own barbell movements in gear 5. So something to play with, and we are going to try to mix it up, but it's really hard to breathe through your nose with a barbell on your like your shoulders or up over your head.
I think if this is something that's strange to someone too, it's much like heart rate. It's hard to sometimes view it in the CrossFit lens. Mm-hmm. And so like if you always just view it like in a running lens, it makes way more sense. You know what I mean? It lets you at least start understanding the ideas, because it is different to have running is so cardiovascular in most points that it breathing in through your nose, out through your nose is a very conscious thing. But when you have
if you're doing burpees, for example, you're slamming your chest onto the ground.
Yeah, or 225 in a front rack or something. It's like,
there's some artifact.
No idea what that feels like.
One thing that I really like is, this is from the OPEX school of thought, from James Fitzgerald, is you can kind of start to make things feel like the monostructural movement. So monostructural being like rowing, biking, running, swimming, where it's very consistent, it's cyclical, and there's a feeling. If you're rowing at 2 minutes per 500, that has a feeling. If you're rowing at 140 per 500, that has a feeling. And then especially if we're going back and forth between that and, let's say, a barbell movement, and we want to make it sustainable, well, I want that feeling to be the same. And so maybe I'm breathing in through my nose and out through my nose. I'm in gear 3 on the rower, but then I go and I've got some barbell cycling to do, and I'm going to open my mouth so I can keep my respiratory mechanics sound. Well, instead of just ramping it up to gear 5, even though my mouth is open, I'm going to keep the feeling the same and have that carryover. And that's one way we can kind of work through that artifact of the barbell crushing our chest.
I think one cool thing about this, too, is it's unlike, once again, heart rate, which I always compare these to, it's transferable on the fly to no matter what you're doing.
Absolutely.
Whether you're fight or flighting, or if you're playing basketball, or if you're running or biking or swimming outside of the gym, it instantly, you don't need anything to make it happen. It's just once you know it, you know it.
It's there. Going back to the programming thing, so if you're working on something and you really want to drive home the movement pattern, so let's say you're in that phase with the power cleans and you just want to make sure that you're moving very efficiently, force yourself to slow down and keep it gear 3. There's a big piece of movement patterns from the nervous system. Obviously, it's a coordination thing. And if we're calm or calmer, we're more likely to remember and be able to practice things that are going to last for a long time. So even though it's going to slow you down, even though you're not going to get the score maybe that somebody else did, the long-term benefit of just forcing yourself to be in gear 3, you're going to have to think about how you're moving, because you're going to have to be efficient because you're regulating your oxygen intake and CO2 output. So if you're learning a movement or you want to get better at that efficiency, keep it in gear 3 for those things for a while, and that's going to play big dividends later on.
Well, and coming from a lifelong, committed mouth breather, like I'm the guy who sleeps on a plane, like just waiting for someone to prank me. I mean, being cognizant about it just in your daily life is big too. I mean, one, my dentist always told me it's bad for your teeth because you're drying out your gums and mouth or whatever, and causing problems. And we talked about that you're not filtering through your nose, so you're getting particulates in your lung. One reason, interesting thing that we talked about too, was that's why sometimes a lot of obese people have irritant problems with their lungs, because they're constantly mouth breathing, because they're constantly in like a zone 2 heart rate. But
and they have sleep apnea and some other things where they're so The cool part, and this is something that I really think is important, especially post-COVID, is that it also gears us a little bit more to pay attention to our bodies. So if we're constantly just letting the wheels come off, we're just coming in and slamming CrossFit workouts and just getting that release, we're not as cognizant of what's actually going on underneath the hood. Right. And so if we can get a little bit more in tune with that, and the breathing in any avenue is the doorway to what's going on with your internal physiology, what's going on in your like arterial blood gases. It's an intimate window, and we can start to apply that. We can take it outside of the gym as well. So something that we've been playing with is if I'm gearing up to gear 5, which is a very intense fight or flight thing, what happens, how does my body feel when I go back down, right? So let's say I'm just gunning it on a bunch of power cleans. We're just cycling through. I'm in gear 5, and then I go for a run that's supposed to be a recovery run. Well, cool. Now I can actually use these gears. I can downshift over that run. I start out in gear 5. I'm jogging a little bit. I get to the point where I can go to gear 4, nasal in, mouth out. Then I can get to gear 3 by the end of the run. And so when I come back in, I'm ready to slam that power clean again, right? And I know that my pace is accurate because I was able to down regulate a little bit. Well, the cool thing is as you're cooling down after your workout, you can use that downshift and that feeling. And we can take that outside of the gym. Obviously, the world is a little stressful right now, right? There's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of things going on during 2020 that are hard to deal with. Well, so if you look at somebody that has panic attacks or anxiety, or they hyperventilate and they can't stop, if you've ever seen somebody hyperventilate, they're mouth breathing, right? And they're panicked. So they're in that fight or flight state. Well, if we can start to use what we've learned from the gears in the gym, we can now apply that. Well, I can take from mouth breathing. I can get back control. I can go nasal in, mouth out. Cool. Still fast, still a little panicky. But once I can get comfortable with that, now I can go to gear 3, right? I can close my mouth, and maybe I'm still breathing fast, but I'm okay. I have more control over what's going on. I've got a foot in the door, and I can start to take control over downshifting out of that panicked anxiety or hyperventilated state. So super neat application of what we can do to downshift. Or, for example, if you're just angry in traffic, right, and you kind of lose it and you get heated, if you pay attention to it, you're probably mouth breathing. You're probably a little angsty, maybe not very fast.
Not paying attention to it at that time.
But probably not paying attention to it. But if you needed to calm down, cool. Usually it's like take a deep breath in. And we take a deep breath in, but that fast inhale kind of drives us up. Well, what if it was like, all right, I'm in gear 5 right now for no reason because somebody cut me off. I need to down regulate, right? I need to calm down because this is silly. And so then you can start to use that gear 4 back to gear 3 and kind of bring your state back. And that gives you just a lot more control over your psyche, which is important. So can of worms.
Off the soapbox.
Yeah.